that's bad hermeneutics. It's not how exegesis works. That's not how syntax works. That's not how language works. You have to let the language encode what it is encoding. Yeah, no. That is absolutely just pure assertion. It's just picking and it's literally, I've never seen like picking and choosing like this before. Well, it's got to do Canaan because if he cursed Ham, then Noah would be cursed. Like, what are you talking about? Because of covenantal justice. Like, what? Karate Pantes. Part 3. This will be the last part going into Dale's video, The Curse of Ham Finally Explained. I'm going to now advance in the video to minute 23, where Dale's going to get into the textual backing of his argument. He's going to bring up 5 questions that he's going to answer for us. And this is going to be the crux of his argument. This is going to be the foundation of why he believes it is actually Ham and then all of Ham's posterity that are cursed. Canaan maybe more specifically, but really not just Canaan. And he's going to go through his different views of what the actual sin was that Ham committed against Noah. And we'll interact with that. And then we'll wrap it up. And hopefully if you were watching this and maybe you thought Dale was convincing prior, you can at least ask yourself, okay, there's some big problems here, especially if he's going to bring in church history and claim that he has it on his side. And clearly when it's read, it's going against all of that Dale is going to bring up, especially in this part 3. So let's dig in.
From the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. These 3 were the sons of Noah, and from these people the whole earth were dispersed. Noah began to be a man of the soil, and he planted a vineyard. He drank of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his 2 brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it both on their shoulders, and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned backward, and they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers." He also said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant." End quote. The central question of this text is this: what is meant when it says that Ham saw the nakedness of his father? The reason this passage generates so much discussion.
Yeah, that's interesting emphasis. He's going to say the crux of this is, what did Ham actually do to Noah? I don't think that is the crux. I don't think that's the thing we need to be focusing in on. Remember, Genesis is trying to show that the problem with man is sin, and it doesn't matter what environment man is in, or if all of natural evil is removed, or even other evil men are removed, that in the end, because we are corrupt, because the fall infested all things, our natures are corrupt. And you're going to see this corruption again in the act. So does the writer want us to focus on what is the sin that Ham did? There are hints. And I do think the writer is using delicate language to explain something very disgusting that happened, just like Genesis 3 does with its flowery language, using trees and fruits to describe a sin that happened in the garden that was probably pretty disgusting. And the language used in Genesis in the opening of it is Near Eastern language for sexuality, right? It is just clear, well, I would say innuendos, I guess, of sexuality. And we're seeing those innuendos here because, again, the writer wants you to connect these 2 events together, Genesis 3 and then here in Genesis 9, not to try to pick apart what exactly did Ham do, because we need to figure out why Canaan is cursed and not Ham. I think Dale's actually completely missing the point by trying to scratch the surface of things that we probably aren't ever going to know. And as I read the church fathers and the historical Christians and Jews prior to Christ, their understanding of what happened is they're not sure either. And they're saying, well, clearly Ham sinned and probably Canaan too. But their focus was not always trying to figure out what Ham did, but the consequences of it and the warning that comes through that.
Is because of the severity of the consequences described in verses 24 and 25. When Noah...
Yeah, the severity of the curses echoes the severity of the curse of Genesis 3.
Woke from his wine, it says, and he knew what his youngest son had done to him. He said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers." It leaves us with 5 questions. First, what exactly did Ham do to Noah? Second, why curse Canaan for Ham's sin? Third, is the curse on Canaan actually a curse on Ham? Fourth, if the curse is on Ham's posterity, how has it manifested itself in Scripture and history? And then fifth, how should Christians, Shemites, Hamites, and Japhethites think about race, nations, and civilizations? So I want to start with just addressing question number 1. What exactly did Ham do to Noah? Now, we are asking this question for 3 reasons. Number 1, a drunken man lacks awareness of his own actions, let alone the awareness that someone has seen him naked. So the fact that Noah awoke and realized that something had been, quote, done to him strongly suggests that more occurred than just a mere accidental glance at nudity. Number 2, the severity of Noah's prophetic curse upon Ham's line also seems to imply some far more serious sin than simply seeing his father uncovered. Number 3, Scripture never explicitly condemns a child or a relative for accidentally or innocently seeing a parent uncovered. The Bible, nowhere, treats nudity as some sort of criminal offense. Now, because of...
I'd actually agree with all that Dale said there, surprisingly. But yeah, I don't... It's much worse than simple accidental viewing somebody naked, viewing Noah naked. There's much more going on there because the language is echoing Genesis 3, using that same kind of, dare I say, mythological innuendo-esque language for sexual things.
Of these 3 reasons, scholars have generally arrived at 3 interpretations of this passage, which I'm going to present to you so that you can consider them for yourselves. The first is the voyeurism view, which claims that Ham saw his father undressed and mocked and gossiped about his father's nakedness. And this is the majority modern view, but it's the historical minority view.
No. Go back to part 1. Go back to part 1 and read what Origen thinks. Because Origen, again, is interacting with the Bereshit Rabbah and how it's suggesting what happened. It's much more than Ham seeing Noah naked and then mocking and gossiping about it. Some believe that Canaan might have been the one that saw it first and then told Ham, and then Ham, and then they mocked him, and then they just absolutely despised the authority and actually the man that saved them. Because remember, God saved Noah, and the only reason that his family was also saved was because they attached themselves to Noah, which will be important later as Dale brings up another question as far as federal headship is concerned. But there's much more going on, and him to say that's the modern view, it's like, what are you reading? What are you reading? Now, I will agree that's not the only view historically, but that's not something modern. I wouldn't call Origen modern. And not only that, but Calvin trying to wrestle with this, as we talked about in part 2. He just chalks it up to God's justice. He doesn't really, in that part of the commentary anyway, he doesn't explain what he thinks actually happened in the tent with Ham and Canaan.
And the reason I think this view is so popular is that it's like a flat reading of the text. I think it's the least intellectually complex, and it seems to just be very, that's what it says, I'm going to believe it.
Okay, I that's interesting that Dale would say that. I would love to see his exegesis of the actual Hebrew, because he is right in saying that some of the language used is flowery and is describing sexual things, but there are some other aspects of it that are, well, he would call it two-dimensional, but mean what they mean. So when Shem and Japheth don't engage, or they actually actively cover their father's nakedness, walking backwards, not so that they don't see it, that could be indicative of what is actually occurring. If it's the voyeurism view, there could be something that is absolutely awful, degrading Noah's authority and the very man that saved the entire family and humanity, right? By believing what God said and doing what He said. So this intellectually, it's not intellectually complex. Yeah, who cares? It's the two-dimensional reading. Have you exegeted the Hebrew? Are you breaking it down? Are you showing the Vav consecutives in the opening of Genesis 9:1 and showing why it doesn't matter that God blesses Ham and this has nothing to do with it? Are you doing that? Or are you reading a translation? You just don't find it compelling. You found other scholars' explanations more intellectually exciting.
Now, if this view is true, it's the only passage in the entire Bible where someone is condemned for visually seeing someone uncovered.
That's not what happened, though. It wasn't just seeing them uncovered. And Dale's right about that. There is no text where somebody accidentally saw their accidentally go, oops, my eyes, I blinked and I didn't see you there, and there you are naked, and now I'm cursed, and all my line is like, no, that's never happened. But to minimize it that way, Dale's like two-dimensionalizing his two-dimensional view, or what he's just argued as a two-dimensional view. He's flattening what's already been flattened.
Now, its weaknesses are its inability to explain, one, the strong language used in the passage, two, the severity of the curse.
Not if you understand that by dishonoring Noah, by seeing his nakedness and mocking and gossiping him, that they're mocking Yahweh. They're mocking God through that. Because again, Yahweh saved Noah, and they are saved through Noah. Ham and Shem and Japheth, they weren't the ones that were called out to build the ark. Noah was. Now they stayed with him, but to then go and mock, your father being laid out naked, because maybe it's true. Maybe Noah forgot what it was like to drink wine and got drunk accidentally. So therefore you should protect, right? You should protect that, your father, that authority. And by raising his name up, you're raising up the God that saved you. But to do that, man, that is almost like murder, because you're minimizing the God that just wiped out everybody else and saved you. And then you're going to mock the guy being in a weak state from being drunk on wine. That's pretty harsh. And if the law later, and Deuteronomy, Leviticus, and Exodus, if the law kills those for disobeying the Sabbath, and we have the example of the guy picking up sticks on the Sabbath, is put to death, because again, he's actually murdering people by disobeying what God says and saying you don't need to listen to him, you don't need to remember what God has done for you out of Egypt. If they're going to put people to death for that, does it then sound that much more minimal that God would curse Canaan for what Ham did in light of that? I don't think so. I think it's not intellectually vigorous, because Dale probably hasn't thought about it enough, honestly.
Curse. And three, why Canaan was targeted by Noah and not Ham. The second view is the sodomy or the castration view, which claims that Ham had sexual relations with his father, or that he maybe amputated his manhood or something. Now, this view and the third view, which I'll give in a second, both see this phrase in the passage, the nakedness of his father, as a Hebrew idiom for some sort of sexual activity.
And I totally agree with Dale here. That language is describing some kind of sexual activity.
Now, several Reformed theologians, including Luther, held this possible sodomy view or something like that.
I actually myself lean towards that, just because of what the sons do Shem and Japheth after the fact, when they after whatever Ham does after the fact, how they react to it, because over what Dale was going to suggest as the third option here.
The strength of this view is that it explains the severity of the curse. It provides context for Noah's words in verse 24, which said,
okay, let me just jump in. I don't think it's, then that actually makes the severity of the curse understandable. Like, well, no, it's understandable in the first position as well, but for all the reasons that I suggested.
Noah knew what his youngest son had done to him. It gives kind of a rational explanation for how a drunken Noah would have come to know that something had been done to him, because he would have physically felt the aftermath of some sort of sexual violation when he woke up. But its weakness is still that it doesn't explain why the curse was directed at Canaan, which is Ham's son. So
again, just because Canaan is not clearly implicated in the rendering of what happened in Genesis 9, historically, people would conclude that Canaan was somehow involved, because again, it is a hard thing to say. Why would God, and again, just going back to Calvin on the last podcast, Calvin had to wrestle with, why would God in his justice unleash his curse upon Canaan, who seemingly didn't do it? Calvin's going to chalk it up to nobody's innocent. God can bring out his justice on all, and perhaps Canaan was a pretty awful guy himself, and would have, if he wasn't a part of it, would have approved of it, or would have done it himself if he just had the chance or something like that. And that's how the curse was dispensed. But everyone has struggled with the idea of understanding why Canaan is the one that bears the weight of what's going on. My personal, I do think Canaan is involved somehow, is my personal opinion. And I will say that's more reading into the text, or it's what the text is formulating as it's structured, that Canaan is probably implicated in it somehow, but we don't know how.
The third view is the maternal incest view, which claims Ham had sexual relations with Noah's wife, his mother. And this view is held by E.W. Bullinger, Dr. Michael Heiser, seemingly Peter Leithart, Roman Catholic scholar Scott Hahn, and John Bergsma.
Okay, that's interesting. Heiser, maybe Leithart, and then two Catholic scholars, Hahn and Bergsma. Heiser, I don't know. I didn't have the time to look up Heiser's view. I don't read a lot of Heiser anyway, but so I'll give Dale the benefit of the doubt and say that Heiser believes that. He says possibly Peter Leithart. It's interesting that he said it like that, because as I was researching this, I found an article by the Theopolis Institute, I think it was by Peter Leithart, back in 2005, responding to the other two scholars that Dale names at the end there, Bergsma and Hahn, who wrote an article in 2005 in the Journal of Biblical Scholarship arguing this position of maternal incest. Now, I don't know if Michael Heiser believed that prior to Bergsma and Hahn's thesis in 2005 or after. I don't know that. But the primary pushers of this maternal incest view is Hahn and Bergsma. There might be some other historical that I'm not aware of. It's very possible. And I just don't know. If anyone does, go ahead and link it in the comments. But I ironically have found that the maternal incest view is the modern one, where Dale said the voyeurism one is the modern one. It seems like the maternal incest one is, because 2005, I mean, I'll consider that modern and like yesterday in the scheme of time. So I've actually, and so I looked up Hahn and Bergsma's article from the journal, and I read it, and it is actually fairly compelling, and Dale's going to go into its primary arguments, and we'll hash it out. But all I want to show is that from my research, that view, because Dale's going to hold to the maternal incest view, spoilers, that view is the modern one. not the prior two are more historical. You'll find those clearly in church history and midrashes and stuff.
And I want to go back to this phrase as we just think about this phrase, the nakedness of his father. Now, as I said, this is a Hebrew idiom for sexual activity. The term uncovering nakedness is a euphemism used throughout the Old Testament for sexual intercourse, especially incest or relations with someone biologically forbidden, like a close relative, a stepmother, or something like that. And so I'm going to read you just 4 passages of scripture that will help you see what I'm talking about. Leviticus 18:7-8 says, quote, "You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father, which is the nakedness of your mother. She is your mother. You shall not uncover her nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife. It is your father's nakedness." End quote. Leviticus 20:11 says, quote, "If a man lies with his father's wife, he has uncovered his father's nakedness." End quote. Deuteronomy 22:30 says, quote, "A man shall not take his father's wife so that he does not uncover his father's nakedness." End quote. Deuteronomy 27:20 says, quote, "Cursed is anyone who lies with his father's wife because he has uncovered his father's nakedness." End quote.
Okay, that's important. If you read the article, those are all the texts that Hahn and Bergsma will lay out, actually in the Hebrew, and engage with it in the Hebrew, which is much more compelling than what Dale's going to give us. However, I just want to consider this: when in Leviticus, when it's giving those prohibitions, in the back of our mind, we might think like, is everybody sleeping with their mothers? Well, certainly that's not outside the schemes of man, right? Surely. However, I think it's pointing to this idea of divorce and remarriage. Remember, because Moses allowed Israel to divorce and remarry because of the hardness of their heart. So if you had wives that were let go, that and then a man got remarried, and so the child from the first wife, they're not blood related, so fair game, right? And it's like, no, it's your father's wife. Obviously, your mother would be the clear one, right? But the text is saying your father's wife because we see this even in the New Testament in Corinthians, right? Where it's like the guy's committed incest with his stepmother. Probably because he's like, well, there's no blood relation there, right? And if, even later when men divorced their other wives, like maybe a son would marry her or was attracted, whatever, that would be uncovering your father's nakedness. So Leviticus is expanding an idea that is already known. Like everyone at this point already knows what like the foundational uncovering your father's nakedness means, which would probably be like either having relations with your own father or with your own mother. But now Leviticus is actually expanding it out to like it's your father's wife. Oh, also you see this in the New Testament with the Sermon on the Mount when Christ is teaching the law from the mount or the plain and whatever gospel you read. But when he's expanding, quote unquote, expanding the law, not really expanding it, but explaining it in its full purpose, its initial purpose, you see that there's a blanket or a foundational understanding for like, do not murder, thou shalt not murder. And then Christ is like, you've heard it said this, right? But I say, if you hate your brother, that you've committed murder. So like there's an expansion or a further understanding of what murder means or adultery means. It's more than just actually sleeping with somebody else's spouse or someone that's not your spouse. No, it actually is lust, right? So I do think Leviticus is doing that as well. The law does that as well. It expands something out that's already understood. So the similarities in syntax and structure of Leviticus to Genesis 9 are going to be very apparent because the foundation, perhaps this very sin, being maybe it is sodomy, maybe it is literally uncovering Noah's nakedness, and Ham did something to Noah sexually, right? It wouldn't negate the fact that Leviticus is drawing from Genesis 9 and not just a mere copy of it. It's using the same language because it wants to expand to Israel. Like, no, even this that you might not think is uncovering your father's nakedness, because we all know what the basic one is. But even sleeping with a wife, his third or fourth wife, would be considered uncovering your father's nakedness also.
Now, at first, I kind of struggled to buy in because in our passage, it says that he saw the nakedness of his father, not uncovered the nakedness of his father. But then I found Leviticus 20, verse 17, which directly links seeing and uncovering together. It says, quote, if a man takes his sister, a daughter of his father, or a daughter of his mother, and sees her nakedness, it is a disgrace, and they shall be cut off in the sight of the children of their people. He has uncovered his sister's nakedness, and he shall bear his iniquity.
See, this is interesting that Dale uses this verse as what brought him over the edge of suspicion, I guess, or like whatever issues he had. I would love to hear what his issues were. But in this text, where if he's going to say, well, I saw that it said that Ham saw his father's nakedness, and then I see it in Leviticus 20. Well, you notice in Leviticus 20, it's if a man takes his sister, a daughter of his father, and sees her nakedness, he has uncovered the sister's nakedness, not the father's. So this is the brother having intercourse with the sister. So if Ham, saw the nakedness of Noah, wouldn't that imply then that it's literally Ham doing something with Noah? If Leviticus 20 is going to be the example here. So I found that weird that Leviticus 20 would be the text that put Dale over the edge.
End quote. Then I found other verses I'm not going to read, but Ezekiel 16, 36 through 37 and 22, 10 also use this term seeing and uncovering nakedness as like a synonym. So ultimately, what these passages show is that violating your mother is violating your father. Seeing your father's nakedness.
See, everybody knew that. That's not good as... I don't think that's not... I have to look up the Hebrew again, and if I'm wrong, I'll correct it or a producer will correct it. But in Leviticus, it's your father's wife. Yeah, your mother's obviously included in that, but it's going beyond that.
Is sleeping with your mother. Now, why? Because under God's law, a wife is one with her husband, and so when you violate her, you violate him. Now, you have to be thinking...
That's true too, but that's also true with the other wives also, because when they become one flesh, right, it is like sleeping with your father. If you were to sleep with your stepmother, or the fourth wife, or the fifth, if they were, if the divorce went that far.
If this was more than voyeurism, then why does verse 23 say of Shem and Japheth, their faces were turned backward and they did not see their father's nakedness? Again, that sounds kind of like they're avoiding some sort of visual crime, not a sexual crime, right? So to that, I would argue that if the phrase is idiomatic on the front end, then it has to be consistent, we have to read it in verse 23 as idiomatic on the back end. So the verse...
Okay, what hermeneutical rule is that? We would read it idiomatically if that is the meaning of the text. You can't just say, well, if it's idiomatic on the front, it's got to be idiomatic on the back. Like, okay. So if we're going to say seeing is comparable to actually doing something sexually, then Japheth and Seth or Shem did not. They covered their face, so they did not participate in the act. They probably didn't even know what was going on at the time. Otherwise, they would have probably stopped it in the act. This is something that maybe Ham did brag about it in the end, and the other two brothers came and honored their father in the best and the only way that they could. But this principle here that Dale said, well, it's got to be, if we're going to read it idiomatically on the front, then we must read it idiomatically on the back. That's bad hermeneutics. It's not how exegesis works. That's not how syntax works. That's not how language works. You have to let the language encode what it is encoding. And Hebrew specifically, because there's a lot of hapax, one-use words, one-use phrases, some things that, because we don't have a plethora of manuscripts of Hebrew that we can compare and contrast like we do with Greek. Greek's much easier to do that with. So there are things that we're like, we're not exactly sure what's being said here. I think Genesis 9 falls into that a little bit, but I just would disapprove of that hermeneutic. And if you watch the debate between Samuel Say and Dale. I think it was last week. Did I mention that already? I don't know. It was last week, but Samuel actually brings up Dale's improper hermeneutic as well.
Says Shem and Japheth did not see their father's nakedness. It really means that they did not partake in violating their mother as Ham did.
Their mother. Yes, it's such a weird well, they didn't participate in the sexual act. That's true.
And so the reason I believe this view is the most coherent is because it offers the most explanatory power of the passage. So a few other things. Number one is the Bible has more direct words for homosexuality and sodomy. And so if the sodomy view were...
Yeah, there's words for homosexuality and sodomy with other men. With your father is different. It's covering the nakedness of your father. There's something unique about that.
True. Moses would have likely used the word for sodomy that he uses
Okay. Moses. Okay, Dale.
throughout the Torah. Second, the idea that Ham would attempt to curse Noah's line by producing illegitimate seed is perfectly consistent with the entire narrative of Genesis and the Old Testament. In fact, we see this pattern over and over. Cain's rebellion, the Nephilim, Abraham's sexual sin with Hagar producing Ishmael, the rivalry between Jacob and Esau, in which one became the true seed and the other was rejected. And so...
Yeah, that's true, but are any of those like sleeping with their mother? I mean, you have Lot's daughters that get him drunk and sleep with him. But that's not an authority issue. That's because they were concerned that Lot wouldn't have children.
This war between the legitimate and illegitimate seeds runs throughout the entire Old Testament. So the idea that Ham committed a sexual sin in order to produce illegitimate offspring, I think it fits squarely within Scripture's recurring theme. Number three, the Bible sees sleeping with a king's wife as like the ultimate form of dominance. And this is what Absalom did to his father David. Absalom publicly slept with his father's concubines on the roof of the palace as really...
Hold on. Did Absalom sleep with his own mother, though? I mean, it's true. Absalom, you read it right there. He sleeps with the concubines, and it is an act of control and spitting on his father's authority and trying to usurp his father. But he doesn't sleep with his own mother. Now, you can say, like, well, is it because they're the only humans left and Ham's only opportunity to have his own seed that would take over Noah is with his own mother? I guess that's what Dale would have to argue, but I don't see, even in his example with Absalom, he's not sleeping with his mother.
Really a deliberate way to humiliate David and to secure his own claim to the throne. And this was a way to disgrace the previous ruler and establish your own dynasty or royal succession. And number four, most importantly, is the maternal incest view is the only view that offers a coherent answer for why Noah directs this curse toward Canaan, which leads us to our second question.
It still doesn't, though. It still doesn't, because if Dale is trying to come up with an understanding of why God would curse Canaan if Canaan seems innocent, well, if he's the offspring of an ancestral relationship, then he's automatically cursed. But if that were true, then why would Noah have to call down the curse of God? Because it is a passive, and when Noah cursed be Canaan, it's a call passive. So Noah is invoking God to do something to Canaan. But this seems to be like the way Dale's describing it is that Canaan would be more naturally cursed as an incestuous child, which that's problematic too, because again, then Noah wouldn't need to curse him. He just would automatically be cursed.
Why did Noah curse Canaan for Ham's sin? So Canaan wasn't cursed because of what he did. Canaan was cursed because of who he was. Canaan was the incest child and illegitimate seed.
You see, that's the problem there. I would say he's not cursed of who he was. There's a curse. The curse of the Canaanites becomes how they behave, like their sexual depravity, and their inhospitality and their sexual depravity that are what defile the land for hundreds and hundreds of years until the land can't take it anymore and it spews them out, and God uses Israel to wipe them out. But the curse is probably, the curse is not because of who he is. The curse is an indication of what Canaan will be about, which enforces in my mind why Canaan was probably involved somehow in the sexual act, either covering it up or trying to do something with it. And it has nothing to do about him just being the offspring of it, but him being cursed by always being known as sexual deviance, because the sin was sexual deviancy.
Seed of Ham. But this leads us, or leaves us with another question. If Canaan is cursed, what are the consequences for Ham? Which leads us to the episode's third question. Is the curse on Canaan actually a curse on Ham? Now, in the ancient covenantal world, a son was not viewed as an independent individual in the way that we think today. We have to kill off our modern tendency toward individualism. In a covenantal framework, there's no disconnecting the curse on Canaan from the curse on Ham. And that's why so many historical theologians have arrived at this conclusion. A son was the extension and public representative of his father. We see this in the ministry of Christ, but his name, his honor, his shame, his future were all bound up in his father's identity. That's a thing in the Old Testament. And this is why names in Scripture so often carried the father's name, right? Simon Bar Jonah literally means Simon, son of Jonah. When Saul saw David fighting Goliath, he didn't ask, who is that young man? No, he asked in 1 Samuel 17, 55 through 56, whose son is this youth? See, Saul wanted to know the father because the son represented the father. So the glory that David won against Goliath reflected directly back on his father Jesse. Now, under God's order, to bless or curse a son was to bless or curse the father. And this is like, I think, the key to understanding why Noah cursed Canaan and not Ham directly. If Noah had pronounced the curse on Ham, the shame of Ham's sin would have actually fallen back onto Noah himself, the father of this incest offender. So by Noah...
Okay. Dale has just described for us that in my study of how Near Eastern covenants work and how federal headship operates in the Near East, that this is completely incompatible with that. He's absolutely right when he says that we cannot view children as separate from us. He's absolutely right about that. And Dale probably gets this from being around the CREC and those that, Theopolis Institute. This is why we give communion to our children, and we baptize them and give them communion, all the things of Christ, because our children, God does not see our children as separate from us until they actually do something that disconnects them from us, either deny the faith or don't no longer want to be under submission to our household and leave or something like that. So he is absolutely right, but his view of covenant here is really whacked. So he has a Presbyterian, I think, view of covenant where God has, I guess, entered covenant with Noah, right? So he's entered covenant with Noah. I'm going to save you. And then they come off the ark and they're blessed again. He says, do this, be fruitful, multiply. All the beasts of the earth will be afraid of you. And, oh yeah, and by the way, kill the one who tries to murder the image bearer, or kill the one that murders the image bearer, because they're not image bearers. You have that commission both to Noah. So you have this covenant, and somehow there's this weird connection with Ham and Canaan, where if Noah were to, in this covenantal view, if Noah were to curse Ham directly, then somehow Noah would be cursed. So he's got to go one down the line, because God hates the generations, the 10th generation, but of those that hate him, but loves the 1,000th generation. So like mathematically, Noah's got to curse Canaan, otherwise he'd be cursing himself. Like, this is ridiculous. This is not how it works. It's federal headship that is in focus here. It's the federal head that you have to look at. Because if Dale's covenantal view is right, then Noah cursing anybody in his line, Ham or Canaan, would bring the curse back on to Noah. They're not, because if they're all connected, why would the connection stop at Ham? Dale doesn't explain that at all. This is just thrown in here. This is some weird assertion, some some twisted covenantal understanding, but it makes perfect sense when we understand federal headship. The head is the top of the family, and then whoever flows down from that federal head, they receive the blessings or curses of that person. So if Noah actually realizes, one, I totally believe that Noah knows that he cannot curse Ham because God has already blessed him, and two, maybe Noah, let's see, put some added thought into Noah. Now the text doesn't say this, but maybe Noah is being merciful by not cursing Ham, because if he did, by the way federal headship works, then all of Ham's descendants would be cursed. But by just cursing Canaan, it's actually a mercy. So like there is this severity of the curse, but in another sense, there's a mercy to it as well, because he doesn't curse everyone. He doesn't curse everyone. So Dale's weird, unbiblical, I would even say non-Near Eastern view of covenant, rather than a proper view of federal headship, makes these, like, the river of curse is all like swirling around. It doesn't make any sense. It's not. He doesn't want it to flow back, so he's got to have a valve so the back pressure doesn't go back up to Noah. It's got to go. It doesn't make any sense, and it doesn't flow with the understanding of federal headship. I think if Dale had a better understanding of federal headship, he would be able to categorize that in his mind and understand why Canaan is cursed and why it's not all of Ham's posterity.
Particularly directing the curse onto Ham's son, Canaan. The shame and judgment would generally fall back on Ham.
No. Man, okay. Let's think about Eli and Samuel. Eli and his sons. Eli's sons. Eli's a prophet or a priest. And, well, no, he's a judge, right? Yeah. Anyway, so his sons are priests, and they're doing despicable things in the temple. And what Eli should have done as a father is rebuke them, and actually should have brought them before the judges. They should have ruled that they committed sins that were worthy of death, and they should have been stoned. That's how it should have worked. Eli didn't do that, and God punishes Eli. He kills the sons, and he removes Eli from the scene, right? But ultimately, the sin is it's the children's sin that Eli didn't stop. So as Eli is, you can see like the flow as Eli is the federal head over the children. Eli's punished because he doesn't do what the federal head should do. And so the federal head and the children are taken out in the end. But in this case, the idea of Noah cursing Canaan federally means that all the Canaanites that come from Canaan are going to have this curse of sexual deviancy. But that began with Ham's sin, where Eli didn't sin. His sin was not behaving as a federal head, where in this case, even though Ham didn't behave as the federal head that he should have, Noah curses Canaan, because if he, instead of Noah being concerned that it would fall back on him, no, he's probably more concerned that if he cursed Ham, that all of the posterity of Ham would be cursed, because that's how federal headship works.
And so the curse on Canaan was ultimately the curse on Ham. It was like perfect covenantal justice. The fruit was cursed because the root was corrupt. And that is the specific.
Well, the root is Noah, though. The root is, if we're going to view this like in a covenantal frame, the root is Noah. So you can't get away from the fact that Noah would still be implicated in any curse in any of the family members, because they're all covenanted together. They're still living together after the flood. So that would be a problem. So you can't just stop it at Ham.
Specific target of Ham's curse was Canaan, but Canaan's curse only existed because of Ham's evil. And so if I could kind of phrase it another way, while the curse was particularized in Canaan, it did not stop with him. Canaan was simply the first and most visible manifestation of the curse that I will argue flows through Ham's entire line.
Yeah, no. That is absolutely just pure assertion. It's just picking and it's literally I've never seen like picking and choosing like this before. Well, I can't. He's got to do Canaan because if he cursed Ham, then Noah would be cursed. Like, what are you talking about? Because of covenantal justice. Like, what? Do you, what?
Now, some people say, okay, sure, it was a curse on Ham because
No, I don't say
cursing his own son would have been incredibly painful for Ham to watch. But the curse was limited to Canaan. It wasn't to all of Ham's posterity.
Okay, now I did say that. I said that in the last program. You see this throughout Scripture too. I brought up David and his sin with Bathsheba. Yeah, David would rather have died so that his son would live. David wished that Absalom would have lived after all that he did to him. So, like, the curse on the son is like just as bad for the father, even though the father isn't partaking of the curse. The father would probably have, isolated, had taken the curse so that his children wouldn't. Even Paul says this as the sentiment, right? I wish that I were cursed for the sake of my brothers. It's like, there's something absolutely awful about our children taking on something that in our family maybe we started, the sins of us being played out in our children. There is something so awful about that.
Posterity. Now, some of you might be thinking, Dale, that's quite a leap, right? That's quite a leap to say that the curse on Canaan really is a curse on all of Ham's posterity. The text says, right, curse be Canaan, not all of Ham's posterity, right? So here's some further rationale for why I believe this is the correct view, that the curse is not just on Canaan, but also on Ham and all of his posterity to some degree. Again, particularly on Canaan, but generally on Ham. So we have to remember that Noah is speaking to his sons in a covenantal manner. So similar to what we see like with Abraham's blessing on Isaac and Ishmael, or Isaac's blessing on Jacob and Esau, or Jacob's blessings on all of his 12 sons. So these blessings and curses, they're not limited to their own lifetimes. Okay? They are prophetic words to covenant heads that apply to all of their descendants.
That's true even today. So my children, when I bless them with, if they are Christians, right, they're going to receive my blessing, and somehow my blessing is going to continue through their children and their children and their children, as long as they are attached to Yahweh anyway, attached to Christ. So yeah, that is true, and that's why Noah does give particular blessings to Japheth and Shem.
Now, we know this for certain because the very next chapter gives us, in chapter 10, the Table of Nations, which explicitly lays out this principle. For that reason, in a moment of blessing and cursing, it would be extremely strange for God to leave one entire branch of humanity unaddressed.
You notice how Dale says God leaves one entire branch of humanity unaddressed. That's patently false. Dale must be confused. He's attaching God leaving a branch unaddressed versus Noah not cursing Ham is the same thing. It's not the same thing. God has already blessed Ham. God has already said something about Ham. This was brought up during the debate as well. I brought this up weeks ago before the debate. Dale's response to Samuel bringing that up was that, well, God blesses people all the time, but then takes away things when they sin. That's actually true. My question to Dale then would be, what part of the blessing or the covenant that God enters with Noah after the ark with the rainbow and all that stuff, how much of that is taken away from Ham? Because there's the fill up the earth and multiply, but then there's a lot of things that happen after that. So are all of Ham's descendants, will the beasts not be afraid of them? Should they not put murderers to death? Will they? I guess maybe Dale will think that they'll be the ones that are the perpetrators of the murders because they just statistically in our modern day commit the most murders, I guess, in particular nations. So what is that whole thing taken away because of what Ham did? And even though Noah is calling down God to curse Canaan, if it were Ham receiving that, again, what parts of Genesis 9, the beginning of Genesis 9, what parts are removed from all the Hamites? Some of them, all of them. Dale didn't have time to get through that, but I would like him to answer that question.
In other words, this would be the only instance in all of Scripture where a father explicitly blesses some sons while saying nothing to another. So I believe that Noah.
He says nothing to. He doesn't say nothing to another. He does curse a line. He does curse Ham's posterity, but he doesn't say anything. And the line is Canaan. So he's the only son that has a cursed line. The others do not in that particular way. In the sexual deviancy way, because the other sons of Ham do not participate or are implicated in whatever the sexual deviancy is. So Noah does not need to bring him up because God has already brought him up. That is what the text is trying to indicate.
Did say something. I believe he cursed Ham, starting with Canaan. So
is this literally an argument from silence? I think that's kind of funny. Like this, he was silent, so he must be cursed. Is this the first argument from silence? Genesis 9.
He curses Ham in Canaan. And again, this was the prevailing interpretation in much of both Jewish history and Christian history. Okay, an 8th century Jewish midrash says, quote, just as he cursed.
It's interesting that he brings up a midrash of the 8th century. I know they don't like anything, especially the 8th century. Maybe they would be more sympathetic to early midrashes or something. But why are they they don't like the Jewish midrashes. They hate Christ. Their theological purview is whacked. But I guess when it suits them, they'll use Jewish midrashes, but Israel is bad otherwise.
The earth on account of the snake, as it says, may the earth be cursed because of you. So a third of the world was cursed on account of wine, as it says, and Noah awoke from his wine, end quote. St. Ambrose said, quote, Ham was condemned by his father's curse, end quote. Martin Luther says,
of course he was like condemned, meaning he didn't get away with it. This is Calvin's point. Ham doesn't get away with it. It's worse for Canaan to be cursed. They defile the land. You notice that if it were all of Ham's posterity, then why wasn't the land that they occupied being defiled in the way that the Canaanites were defiling it? It's such a. He just picks what he likes and doesn't think about the other stuff.
Quote, Ham is cursed by his father, a servant of servants shall he be, that is the lowest and vilest of slaves, end quote. Matthew Henry, who wrote...
Yeah, he's cursed. The point is that it's one of his sons. Yeah. But that doesn't... Martin Luther is not suggesting that all of Ham's other children... I don't see the difficulty in understanding that Ham is cursed. He's the only one that has a cursed line. He's the only one that has a cursed posterity. It's Canaan. And that's what Ham is known for. You remember when I was reading out of the glossa, and you had the devotional understanding of Ham's sin being the Jews, those or Gentiles that don't believe Christ. And it's the Eucharist that is the cloth that Japheth and Shem covered Noah with. So we cover Christ with the Eucharist, like all this devotional language and allegorical language. But you see how like Ham is the one that's called out for the sin. It's because of him. So that's why everyone's going to emphasize Ham, but that doesn't negate of how the curse plays out. And the blessing that Ham has already received in Genesis 1, and what the language is actually doing, and it not being something that flows upstream. Federal headship doesn't flow upstream, so Canaan being cursed doesn't flow upstream into Ham. It's just not how it works. Federal headship always flows downstream.
The world's longest standing Bible commentary and is like a moderate by like every standard, says, quote, he pronounces a curse on Canaan, the son of Ham, in whom Ham is himself cursed. And
yeah, how do you know? Oh man, this is such bad reading. It blows me away.
Quote, Matthew Poole has a commentary published by Banner of Truth that says, quote, when Canaan is mentioned, Ham is not exempted from the curse, but rather more deeply plunged into it, end quote.
Yes, because his son is like that's, man, this is just not understanding federal headship. I've said it ad nauseum, and we're at 55 minutes.
W.G. Blake.
Go just a little bit further.
Blakely, who was endorsed by Charles Spurgeon, also published by Banner of Truth, said on this passage, quote, though the curse of Ham was formally pronounced on Canaan alone, it has been reflected more or less on the other branches of his family, end quote.
Yeah, that one actually sounds like what Dale's saying. W.G. Blakely. I haven't read him, or I don't know him in context, but that does sound like what Dale is saying. You notice how he's not quoting any church fathers, though?
Abraham Kuyper adds in his book, Common Grace, Volume 1, which is published by Lexham Press, quote, the fact that now, for the first time, the actual history of our human race gets underway is expressed in the prophecy that the Holy Spirit placed on Noah's lips. It led him to sketch out the lines along which history of the world would unfold, in his full blessing for Shem, his partial blessing for Japheth, and his curse on Ham, end quote.
Okay, ungenerous reading of Kuyper. Very ungenerous reading, because Kuyper would argue that the curse on Ham is actually Canaan being cursed. That's it. Poor reading of Kuyper.
And John Calvin, in his commentary on Genesis,
we've already gone through this. This will be interesting how he frames it.
Also published by Banner of Truth, says, quote, and that is to say, Ham is cursed first, as if the words were framed this way. God is not content to punish Ham, who offended, but God's rigor and severity will have to extend further. And God shows from age to age that lineage is an abomination to him. The first thing we...
Which lineage? What's that lineage? Yeah, Canaan.
have to remember about this passage is that God wanted to punish Ham in all his lineage. So it is with good reason that such a sentence is pronounced on Ham and his entire lineage, end quote. So let's just say that you're still not buying it, right? You think the curse was limited only to Canaan and the Hamitic people are not under this curse. Here's a vital point that you have to consider. Even if someone argues that Ham himself is not cursed, we can certainly say that Ham is not blessed. Okay.
Again, he is, just empirically in Genesis 9:1. He absolutely is.
So in either case, whether through an act of curse or through the absence of blessing, Ham and his branch of humanity are being covenantally judged. Okay. And this
covenantally judged. All right. 57 minutes. This is the last I'm going to do with it. Does he go into more argument? I think he goes into how this matters and what we should do with it. Again, I would say something that a minister of the gospel should really not waste his time in doing. This is. I think Samuel Say said this in the debate, and I thought he was right on. This is hashing out genealogies, which Paul says, do not do that. This is trying to figure out who's from who, and we put this person with that person, and I'm better than you. That is actually sin for a minister to do. And I would actually say Dale is in that sin. Dale is doing that. He is worried about genealogy. He's trying to figure out his world and why America is not the best in the world, and you have all these competing religions in America, and he just doesn't understand it because America is a Christian nation, I guess, founded on a Christian principles, and that's his goal. His goal is to bring heaven down now, and he's got to figure out how it works. He's not being a minister of the gospel at all. He's being distracted by this pettiness, and invariably then distracts like me, right? Actual ministers of the gospel, other ministers of the gospel that have responded to him. this will be the last one I do, and this is my, this channel is my hobby, and it helps me think through things, and that's why I do this. But Dale needs to change his trajectory yesterday. Don't waste your time with this, Dale. This is not worth it, dude. Fix your eyes on the things that Paul tells Timothy to fix his eyes on, tells Titus to, and worry about that stuff. Don't waste. I don't know how much study this took you, man, but it's not worth your time. All right. Well, this video hopefully was worth your time. Go ahead and subscribe if you want to. We'll see you next video. Bye.